Hello guys, in this video we're going to be exploring Chapter 7, mostly focused on the development of the Constitution and the impact of it. But before we do that, we have to discuss the idea in terms of what was before the actual Constitution. So one thing that I want to explore is I want you guys to understand what preceded the Constitution of 1787. And why the Articles of Confederation, for that matter, were created. And then what led up to the actual creation of the Constitution. So first, I wanted us to understand the Declaration of Independence is not an actual structure of government. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 was simply us declaring, explaining our independence and why we're doing it, what were our complaints or grievances, if you will, to Great Britain. In 1777, you actually have the drafting of the Articles of Confederation and later ratification. And essentially, this is our first Constitution. The Constitution that we know today is our second one. And it did accomplish some things. It actually coordinated the war effort. It brought us together as the United States. But in regarding the context it was made to limit the national power. And that was done on purpose. Why would we create a strong national government at a time when we're fighting for the reasons against a strong national government? So the Articles of Confederation are a document intentionally made weak, not to overshadow the power of each state. So in order to accomplish that, each state had a vote. Each state had one vote in pretty much the legislative body of the Articles of Confederation. There was no executive branch, there was no judicial branch. It was just a legislative body, and each state had the equal amount of power. And it took 9 states to ratify any changes or anything to under the Articles of Confederation, rather, which is really difficult. That is way more than majority rules. But it did allow us to actually declare war if needed. It allowed us to actually have and negotiate foreign affairs with other countries, and of course to make and sign treaties. So again, it was intentionally made weak on purpose, but did accomplish some things. Most of the power lied in the states, as a confederation would allow. And at the same time that this is happening, you have, during the American Revolution, you have people begin moving west. Remember, westward expansion was a constant driving point for Americans. Washington, when he first went west, helped start the French and Indian War and later the 7 Years' War as it expanded. After the 7 Years' War, colonists felt that now was our time to move west, because that's kind of the reason why the war started to begin with. And you had the Proclamation Line of 1763. And that really angered Americans, because the British put that idea that they're not allowed to move west. And now that the American Revolution is being fought, and then later, after the American Revolution is over, settlers feel now is our time to move west. However, the writers of the Articles of Confederation, and under the Articles, you have this idea it needs to be organized. It cannot just be this everybody rushing to the west without any kind of law, without any kind of order, a way of facilitating that. The other perspective here, too, is the idea that once the American Revolution is over, the Native Americans had backed the British. The Iroquois and the Cherokee in the South had backed the British, and in the minds of Americans, they lost. So the fruits of victory are going to be that land that the Native Americans are on. And because they helped the British, they are no longer entitled to that land. So many settlers flooded into the territories known as Kentucky and Tennessee. And from American perspective, land is essential to freedom. I've mentioned this before in class, and I'll mention before again. To Americans, land is necessary for economic independence, for this idea of liberty and freedom. They have to have land to facilitate that. And in order to get more land, they have to go west. So it's very crucial for Americans' understanding of how they need to live in this country is that they have to have land. And again, to order facilitate this, you have these land ordinances in 1787. So, in other words, the idea being is that this is going to be done in a very organized manner, and these areas would be controlled by Congress. However, there were mechanisms in place to be admitted as states. The lands would be sold in sections, and that money from those sales would be used for Congress. Speculators, though, often took advantage of this and bought this land and sold it later on to people trying to move west. And people were complaining that this was a problem because they themselves as individuals could not afford these larger prices. So that was a bit of a complaint. However, it wasn't really solved at this time. However, unlike the trend towards imperialism that's happening in Europe, you do have this idea that these states would be independent, that these states would have the same power as previous states. In other words, it's this idea of liberty being planted within this ordinance that doesn't really happen everywhere else in Western civilization at this time. And it sets up these ideas that the states will have an equal amount of power as any other states and will not be subject to anyone else once they achieve statehood. So this idea of liberty and independence is kind of blending into this idea of the land ordinance at this time. The other trend that's happening under this land ordinance is that slavery would be prohibited. You have the first little cracks of slavery start setting in, especially in the North, because of the American Revolution. And as a part of this land ordinance, slavery would be prohibited north of the Ohio River in these new territories. So this is again beginning the early trend of northern states not having slavery over time, and then southern states, of course, being more and more entrenched into slavery. So setting up that difference between the North and the South. Over time, though, the weaknesses and the intentional weaknesses under the Articles of Confederation were coming to bear. Part of the problem under the Articles of Confederation, or at least part of the problem that happened economically, is that soldiers were paid in bonds. They were paid with this paper money, if you will. And the idea is that later on, after the American Revolution is over, that they could turn this in and receive actual money, or gold and silver, if you will. So the United States owed a large debt after the war. The problem is that the United States at this time, just like predicted before, they would not be able to trade in the West Indies because the British controlled this trade in the West Indies. And the United States was really hoping on that to actually develop its economy. The other thing that's exasperating this problem is you have, after the American Revolution, the British are letting loose their huge industrial ability and flooding the American market with these very cheap finished goods. So American industry is it's very difficult for it to get off the ground because the British are just flooding the market and undercutting the ability for American artisans to start developing their trade and industry. The other issue that's happening here is that states are developing their own economic policy. There's nothing in the Articles of Confederation compelling states not to do this. So some states are basically forgiving debt. Some states are having harsher mechanisms for collecting that debt. And other states are actually maybe printing their own money. So you have this patchwork of economic policies that are overall hurting the economy of the United States from developing. So this is really being highlighted because of the Articles of Confederation weaknesses. The thing that really starts pushing some Americans to start thinking that they either need to rewrite the Articles of Confederation, amend the Articles of Confederation, and some even say, let's just create a whole new document called the Constitution later, is this Shay's Rebellion. In Massachusetts, the government did not necessarily was on the side of farmers in terms of forgiving debt or printing paper money to help cause inflation. Massachusetts was on the side of the bankers and the money lenders. So farmers, poor farmers, were really upset about this. And out of these farmers, you have this American Revolutionary veteran named Daniel Shay, and this rebellion's going to bear his name. Elites were really bothered by this rebellion among the poor farmers, because to them, they felt the mob, the groups, could actually just come in and take what they want by sheer force of majority. And the elites felt that their property was being violated if the government were to basically start doing things to forgive this debt, because this was their money that they were lending out, and it was not going to get paid back. So their property was essentially being taken away, their wealth. And they felt a national government needed to be stronger to protect the interests of the minorities, in this case, the elites. So you had two different ideas of liberty. You had public liberty, and then you had private liberty. Public liberty in the sense of the masses, the majority, the majority of people, and their ability to do what they want. And then you had private liberty, the ability to protect personal property. So you have these things at odds with each other. And the elites felt that public liberty, the liberty of the masses, the liberty of the people, and just being able to rise up and exert their will onto the minority, was endangering that private liberty, that private property. And the elites felt that people's power was being unchecked, and they needed a stronger national government to protect the minority from the majority. So in this context of the economy not doing well, trade not really doing well, and of course with Shay's rebellion at the end of 1786 going into 1787, you have this development, this idea of a strong national government. The front runners of this idea, if you will, was James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Marshall. And they kind of conceived this idea of nation building, this idea that if the United States was to become a successful nation, they needed to be a commercially successful nation. And this would also lead to diplomatic success, because then other countries will have a vested interest in trade with the United States because of our commercial success, and then it will bring us to a better standing with the rest of the Western world. And Shay's rebellion at the end of 1786 and 1787 kind of pushed this momentum towards this idea of developing a country. Okay, so now that the stage is set for actually bringing people together to write the Constitution, how does that look? So to understand what were the main arguments and compromise in writing the Constitution, that's kind of our objective for this next section. So in May 1787, you have the actual Constitutional Convention. At the time, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were actually diplomats in Europe, so they weren't actually present for the writing of the Constitution. But when we talk about in the 1790s, keep that in mind, because the two political parties, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, are going to be separate from that in arguing in terms of what should be done or interpreting the Constitution. So that'll come back later on. Mostly everyone at the convention were elites, wealthy. By that standard back then, they were very wealthy. And in many respects, they wanted to limit democracy as much as possible. In the minds of the people at that time, Shay's rebellion represented democracy. Shay's rebellion represented the masses exerting the will onto the minority, majority rule, and in their mind, democracy, in many respects, was mob rule. So they wanted to limit that as much as possible. And we'll get to understand how the Constitution is made. But when you look at the end product of the Constitution at that time, there's only one half of one branch that was actually democratic, which was the House of Representatives. At the time, the Senate is actually appointed by each state, by the elites in each state. So democracy doesn't really have a hand in that necessarily, not direct democracy at the very least. The Supreme Court judges are selected for life by the President of the United States, and the president, the office of the president is voted by the Electoral College. And the Electoral Colleges are actually nominated by each state in a similar way that the Senate is. So in other words, there's very few parts of the Constitution, very few parts of the branches that are actually touched by democracy, and that really reflects the fear of democracy that many of the Founding Fathers had. This will change over time, of course, but in the original form of the Constitution, they were very, very scared of democracy. And this is part of that context of Shay's rebellion and these other things that were happening at the time. They wanted to strengthen a national government against those democratic forces. One the other thing they did too was they did this in secret. They did this in private, doors closed. And you can imagine in the summer how hot it would be, but they did this in a very closed environment because they wanted to promote honest debate. They wanted to be able to have honest conversations without fear of what they're saying at the time would come back to hurt them. So in order to promote this, everything was done in private, everything was held in secrecy in writing this Constitution. So one of the first debates that happened in writing the Constitution was how the actual structure of government was going to take place. In much the same way that John Adams first did for the states, they were going to have two legislative bodies. But how they represented the people, or how it was done, or how the power was distributed was one of argument. In other words, how are we going to represent the states? Because each state has there's various sizes, large states and small states. So the Virginia plan basically said we're going to do it based on population to represent the people. But smaller states were angry at that because then they would be outvoted every time. So instead, you have this New Jersey plan that represented the smaller states, where each state has the same amount of votes. But larger states are angry about that because then they're being forced to do things and they feel like they make up the majority of people. So you had this argument, and a compromise would be the House of Representatives would be based on population. And the smaller states got their way in terms of the Senate, where each state had the same amount of people representing each state. So you had these two different bodies of the legislative branch, the House of Representatives based on representation, and the Senate having an equal representation for each state. But remember, like I was mentioning earlier, you have this idea that they wanted to limit democracy. So at the national level, the only thing that would represent the people would be the House of Representatives. It would be the only part that would be democratic. And the idea behind this is that at this time, remember, people still believe in this idea of class hierarchy. And they believe in this idea that only the elites of society should be running things. So they created the Constitution to kind of reflect that. The idea being is that only the elites in each state would be basically representing each state and sending their representatives to Washington, D.C. Or, I'm sorry, correction. Washington, D.C. is not around at this time, to Philadelphia or later in New York. The other part of this Constitution is this idea of federalism. This idea of federalism is the idea that you have a shared structure of government between the national government and the states. So the states would have some rule over people's lives, but then you also have the national government that will keep the states and basically have power, some degree of power over the states. So in a way, federalism is the idea that the states and the federal government agree to share power at this time. So you have these division of powers within the Constitution, not to be confused with separation of powers. Also, you have this idea of checks and balances. So you have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. But besides just separating those powers of the national government, you also have each one being able to check and balance each other, because they are products of Enlightenment thinking. They're also products of the American Revolution. And they believe if you give any one group, any one person too much power, then they will abuse it. That people's tendencies are to abuse power. So we had to make sure as a national government to not create a system where that could easily happen. And we'll talk about times throughout the year in which maybe that did get violated to a certain degree. So the office of the president in that branch was there to enforce the laws created by the legislative and also command the military, commander-in-chief, a civilian leader that is in charge of the military. Congress had a lot of powers in these different separate powers. They had the power to create taxes, to borrow, to regulate money, to declare war, to basically have foreign policy treaties, and also in terms of negotiating things with Native Americans who are separate from the United States under the Constitution. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But essentially, the national laws created in the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. They are the top notch. They are the laws created in the Constitution are the ones that everyone has to follow. So this is increasing the power of the national government, the federal government. But one thing that did enter the conversation in writing the Constitution was the issue of slavery and enslaved people. And slavery was a big part of the country at this time and is going to be a big part of this country for a very long time in American history. But the controversial thing and writing it was the word slavery. They were people that were writing the Constitution were kind of hesitant to actually use the word slavery, especially since in the context of the American Revolution, they were basically casting themselves as slaves to Great Britain. And using the word slavery as a violation of this idea of freedom and liberty. So now that they're actually making their own government, they kind of shied away against actually using the word slavery in the Constitution because they had used it so much in arguments against the British and how it was wrong and how they were being treated. But it's still mentioned in code. You have other persons throughout the Constitution that is actually meant to say enslaved people. So the Constitution actually prohibited this idea about the abolition of slave trade for at least 20 years, not to get southern colonies, southern states, especially South Carolina, to walk away from the negotiating table. They did also have conversations about a fugitive slave requirement. And you have this idea of a 3/5 compromise. Many of these arguments are coming from the South, but especially South Carolina. You might ask yourself, why didn't Virginia put up much of a fight? Their enslaved people, or actually their system of slavery, didn't not necessarily require the importation of slaves, where South Carolina at this time, the Carolinas, are importing a lot of slaves through the slave trade. So the actual slavery in the Constitution made slavery a large part of American life and actually cemented it early on in the early United States history. And yes, the slave trade, according to the Constitution, would end in 1808, but that deadline actually had a magnifying effect to where the closer we got to the deadline, the more importation of slavery would increase. In fact, during this time period, there would be a large percentage of slaves imported at this time compared to all of the 1700s because they're ramping up towards the deadline. Once the 1808 hits, the slave trade would end. And when I mean by slave trade, I mean the importation of slaves into the United States. Slaves would still be bought and sold within the United States. So the idea also is that slaves were still enslaved even in free states. That's part of that fugitive slave law as part of the Constitution. So even if an enslaved person were to go into a territory that were free, they would still be property of the owner. So they would not be allowed to be set free. And the other thing that happened was the 3/5 compromise. Southern states argued that they wanted to actually have their slaves as part of the representation of the United States. Northern states would argue they are not members of your body politic. Why are we allowing this to happen? But in order to appease Southern states, you had this 3/5 compromise where 5 enslaved people will count as 3 people for representation purposes. But also, remember, representation also counts toward the Electoral College. So definitely, this gives slave states a lot of power. Not just in the House of Representatives, but also in voting for president. So it's not a coincidence that many of the first few presidents, with the exception of John Adams, were all Virginians. And that's partly due because of the power that the southern states are going to have because of slavery. So the final document made possible the ability to actually now have a national economy. Remember, the argument before the Constitution was made is you have this really patchwork of economic policies in each state. And the problem with that is you could not create a cohesive economy. And without that cohesive economy, it's very hard to engage in international trade to strengthen the United States and improve our standing with the rest of the Western world. The trade-off being, of course, this is going to reduce the power of the states. And we're going to talk about this later because of the arguments being made. People are going to argue, this is why we fought for the American Revolution to begin with. Why are we going to go ahead and transfer our power from one strong central government to another? This is why we fought the American Revolution against this idea. So some people are not going to like this idea of reducing the power of the states. And again, it limited democracy. It limited the ability to have democracy affect the national government because of Shay's rebellion and other things. They were fearful of this idea of democracy in their minds again. It was kind of like mob rule. The trouble is, it needed to be ratified by 9 out of the 13 states. That was under the Articles of Confederation. You had to have this ratification in 9 out of 13 states. So now the next phase is carrying this argument to the rest of the country for approval for ratification. So in this section, I want you guys to understand, once the Constitution was written, what were the arguments for and against the ratification of it? So there's going to be two groups that come out of this. The two sides are going to be the Federalist side, who are for the ratification of the Constitution. The other side is the Anti-Federalists. Now, I want to say this right now, because I have students every year when we start talking about 1790s, they confuse this group of Federalists for the political party, the Federalists of the 1790s. So we're talking about ratification of the Constitution. The Federalists are the ones that are trying to ratify it. They're on the side of ratification as opposed to the Anti-Federalists. If we're talking about the political party of the 1790s that bears the same name, they're in opposition to Jefferson's political party, who's going to be known as Republicans. Not the Republicans today. That's a whole other set of confusions that we're not going to go over in this video. Just understand, ratification of the Constitution, you have the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. 1790s, development of political parties, you have the Federalist political party versus the Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson. So we'll say that for the next chapter. So the Federalists, this debate happened whether to actually concede and have a stronger national government, to have the ability to rein in the economy and do these things. And so for the most part, when this is happening, this debate, no one is certain that ratification is going to happen. No one knows that this Constitution is actually going to get approved. The leaders of the Federalists are going to be Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And they're going to write a series of essays called The Federalists that are going to be consolidated into the book called The Federalists. And they argued that we should not be afraid of a powerful government, that a powerful government actually protects our liberty, protects our ability to have the freedoms of the country and have a great economy, to have the ability to protect that economy through a strong national government, and protect your personal property as well. So they're going to make these arguments and the ability to do that within these Federalist Papers. One of the most notable Federalist Papers are Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 51, actually written by Madison. And he felt it wasn't just protection from authority. It was to protect property rights. And he also argued that by having all these different groups in our society, this will protect us from one group overshadowing another, from one interest overshadowing the other, because of the size of the country and because there's so much variation in politics and regions and all these other things. that it's going to force people to compromise, that you're going to have a coalition of different minority groups built on compromise. So that's one of the assumptions made by Madison here, is that because there's so many different perspectives, there's so many different self-interests in mind, that people are going to be forced to compromise. That if people don't compromise, this will not work. That our nation is built on actual compromise. And that was one of the most understanding things I'm sorry, I'm studying over myself. It's one of the most important understandings to take away from Madison's thing, is this idea of how the government is supposed to work in Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 51. The Anti-Federalists at the same time, though, there are a number. Not everyone was for the Constitution. So if you notice here on the map here, you have these areas shaded in orange, and they're distributed not only in the South, but also north in areas like New York and Massachusetts and Western Pennsylvania. And they're very much against this Federalists. And it makes sense once you understand the regions. Tend to be a lot of farmers, small farmers, people that were not elites, that were against this idea of a strong central government, because in their mind, they felt like this was exactly what we fought against the American Revolution for. This is exactly what we fought against, this idea of a strong central government. Why are we going to turn around and impose that on ourselves? This goes against revolutionary ideas. And again, Shay's rebellion was sparked out of this idea that farmers felt that they're getting taken advantage of because of inflation, and because of the lack of the ability to make money. They need some kind of debt relief, and this national government's going to favor the elites over them. And others felt that this would protect slavery, because if you recall, slavery as other persons was incorporated into the document. It protected slavery all the way up until 1808, the slave trade, and Southern states had more power in this situation. Other people felt that it might actually be used, the power of the national government might be used to take away slavery, and that's going to be a constant fear of the South going all the way into the Civil War, this constant fear that a strong national government is going to take away slavery. And others argued against what Madison was arguing in Federalist number 10 and 51, this idea that the country is simply too large. The country is too large and too many different competing interests to be run correctly, to be run efficiently. There's no way one national government could really look out for the interests of such a large nation. They felt that self-government really works well in small communities, in local areas. And again, they felt that this government favored the elites as opposed to the lower classes. Ultimately, the Federalists heard these perspectives and agreed to a compromise. This compromise would be to protect the rights of the states. To protect the rights of the states as opposed to a strong national government exerting its will over the states. So you had this idea of Bill of Rights. So let's clarify something here before we move on later. Today, in our modern context, in our modern understanding, the Bill of Rights applies to individuals. That concept did not really happen to the 20th century. At the time of the writing of the Constitution, the idea of the Bill of Rights was more so done to protect the states from the national government. That was kind of the foundation of the Bill of Rights, was to protect the states. The states have rights from the power of the national government. So in order to appease the Anti-Federalists, the Federalists said, yes, we'll have these states. You also have within the Ninth Amendment this idea that this document's not complete. They understood the limitations of their time to think of all the possible things that need to happen. So the Ninth Amendment was there to say other things can be done later on, that the document can be changed. This idea of a living document, it can change over time. And also this idea that any powers that are not in the Constitution, then those are the powers reserved for the states. That those are the power the states have. An example of that affects you as students is education. You guys have to take a state assessment exam. The Constitution does not really run education for the entire country. Those powers under the 10th Amendment are for the states to do. The other thing that was very important to Madison and, of course, Jefferson, but remember, Jefferson wasn't there at the time, was the idea that religion should not be a part of this document. That this is a completely secular document. God is not mentioned in this document at all. And they wanted to create a complete separation of church and state within this document to not repeat the mistakes of European history having religion intertwined with the government. So in this last section, my objective here is, who did the Constitution include and who was it not intended for? What is the meaning behind the words "we the people" in 1787? So one thing that we have to understand is this Constitution was created under a specific context. And at this point in history, not everyone is considered equal. Not everyone is considered people by the idea of "we the people." This term "we the people" definitely has a different meaning for us today than it did back in 1787. So in this part, I want to explore a little bit of what that meant. So in terms of this national identity, in terms of this idea of "we the people," who were the people that were going to enjoy these freedoms? Who were the people that were going to be protected under the Constitution and for the states to have this Bill of Rights protecting them? For Native Americans, this was not them. Native Americans, Indians, were considered outside of this government. They were considered outside the United States. To get an idea of the thinking behind that, when we talk about the Congress's ability to negotiate treaties, they negotiate treaties with Native Americans as if they are a separate country. They're not negotiating with them as if they're part of the United States. They're negotiating these treaties with them as if they're a part of a separate nation. So these Native Americans were not necessarily included in this idea of "we the people." The other persons embedded throughout the Constitution was a direct reference to enslaved people. They were talking about actual slaves. Remember, I talked about earlier this idea that they didn't want to include the word slavery because of fear of the contradictions they had with the American Revolutions, so they used the term "other persons." So definitely, "we the people" did not include Native Americans and enslaved people. But this idea that the West belongs to the Americans. Remember, land and westward expansion and land tying the idea of economic independence and freedom and liberty was very much a part of American culture at this time. And for the most part, Americans felt that Native Americans had lost that right to that land with a victory against the British. But the problem is what to do with the Native Americans. There's kind of three different ideas. One is to just simply push Native Americans farther west, which that does happen. The other part is to remove them altogether in all the things that entails. The other part is actually incorporate them into American civilization, into white civilization, if you will. This idea that they should become farmers and adapt and assimilate into American culture. Even after the American Revolution, you still have fighting and warfare throughout the Ohio Valley. And you had the ability for the American government to try to negotiate after that with them. But most Native Americans rejected this idea of American civilization. They rejected this idea of conforming to their society. A big part of it, too, was this idea that Native Americans, many of them, are matrilineal. When a person engaged in a marriage in Native American society, the male married into the female family. And that is directly in opposition to American ideas of a more patrilineal society. So definitely even that concept was really hard for Native Americans to get around, and definitely worked against this idea of assimilation, incorporating them into American or white civilization. blacks in the Republic. So it is a misconception to think that everybody that's African American in this part of history, after the American Revolution and during the early parts of the United States history, are enslaved people. There were a number of people, as seen in this table here, that were free. Of course, there were more in the North free in the South, but you did have people that were free. So what does this have to do with race? How does race factor into this? And the Constitution really didn't go into detail. The states would have to decide that. Each state themselves would have to decide how race factors into citizenship or not. And some states actually allowed free blacks to vote. There were free blacks that did actually vote on the ratification of the Constitution. But the majority were enslaved, unfortunately. This idea that many of them would not have a status, and that their status would be outside the United States as almost like a separate group of people that were like hidden from the country in terms of its laws or in terms of the Constitution on how they should be treated. And actually, you have the first time this idea of race factoring into law with the Naturalization Act of 1790. In order to become a citizen, they actually contains the words, "You must be free white persons." So it is mixed. There are contradictions here. You have some states actually allowing free blacks to vote, but then you actually have the Naturalization Act that says in order to become a citizen, you must be a free white person. And then, of course, you have the glaring issue of slavery within the United States and what is happening with them in terms of their freedom and lack of liberty, if you will. Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, definitely had various opinions about the role of African Americans and in terms of freedom and liberty, because he was a big student of John Locke. He was a big student of this idea of natural rights. But for Locke and, of course, Thomas Jefferson, they didn't really feel that these ideas of natural rights applied to African Americans. Many viewed African Americans as lacking self-control, lacking the same reason and ability as whites, and they lacked the ability to devote themselves to community. Jefferson reflected partially because many of them were enslaved and had this resentment towards this community, and therefore, because of that, that's part of the reason why they couldn't be members of the community. They factor into this idea that they couldn't be devoted to the nation, that them as free people could never be contributing members of society because of these problems, both as well as a natural inability and also because of the resentment towards what the country has done to them. He did feel, though, that African Americans or blacks, for that matter, could have natural rights, just not in the United States. They felt they could have and develop their own natural rights in separate nations, among themselves in a separate country. However, you do have in the North this idea of slow emancipation, this idea that children born among slaves would be set free. So you have in the Protestant North this change of gradual emancipation that starts to happen. But the problem is, what is the status of these free blacks? So these arguments are going to continue, but definitely the Constitution is going to prompt these different debates that are going to happen. So in conclusion, you have these various ideas of freedom and liberty. You have these ideas of democracy and debates about what role democracy plays in our national government. And of course, you have these ideas of what the roles of Native Americans and African Americans are going to be in this new national government. And these debates are going to continue. They continue all the way to 2021 in terms of race, ethnicity, and the role of liberty and freedom and democracy to a certain extent. And these are going to be subjects we're going to explore throughout the school year. But definitely, these debates were happening at the time of the writing of the Constitution. So it's remember to understand how these things change over time, how they adapt, and to a certain extent, how things don't change. That'll conclude Chapter 7. Thank you for watching.